Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, I am John Zimkus, the Education Director and Historian here at the Harmon Museum, and I want to welcome you to our June Lunch and Learn. I want you to know that your price for admission to the Lunch and Learn includes a tour of the museum. If you want to go through there, it's a delightful museum. I think you'd be surprised how big it is. We are still in the last week or so of our harmonic at the Harmon Museum. Cedric Michael Cox is there. I recently heard him on the radio on WGUC talking about his display being here. And I don't know how well you can see that, but it's fascinating stuff. So it's you'll enjoy that. There's also a discount at our gift shop because you are here with us today. We are having a summer camp, history camp, July 11th through the 14th. So if you know somebody entering 4th grade to entering 8th, the topic will be U.S. Presidents, First Families, and Us. We'll be discussing the presidency, what people think the president can do and what he actually can do are not necessarily the same thing. So we will be discussing that. We will also be visited by, well, our speaker today will be there. We will have Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln, and I can see a representative of Mrs. Lincoln with us today. So they will be here. We will also visit the Golden Lamb and then take a field trip to the Taft Historic Site in Cincinnati, the childhood home of President William Howard Taft. So it should be a very interesting 4 days, Monday through Thursday, 9 to 12. The field trip day might take another half hour, 45 minutes. It is $75 for people who are not members of the Warren County Historical Society, and only $55 for those who are. And that is for the whole 4 days. So if you know anybody who likes history, who's entering 4th to 8th, tell them about that. Our Lunch and Learn for July, which will be Wednesday, July 20th, will be Martin Gottlieb, who is a former editor of the Dayton Daily News for some 20 plus years. Lincoln's Northern Nemesis, Clement Vallandigham. He has written a book about Vallandigham. As some of you may know, Vallandigham died 2 doors north of us at the Golden Lamb, accidentally shooting himself up there. And he was a nemesis, and I'm sure Mrs. Lincoln didn't care for Clement Vallandigham. Martin Gottlieb will be talking about his books and what kind of person Vallandigham was. In August, I will have the pleasure of being your speaker, August 17th. They once blocked out the sun, the story of the passenger pigeon. First off, we'll talk about what is a passenger pigeon, and it has nothing to do with carrying passengers. It's all about a French word of to travel or to pass over. Once they were in the billions and now they are extinct. How they got to be extinct, what they were like, and what Southwest Ohio has to do with the end of the passenger pigeons, and it's fascinating. In September, a former student teacher of mine who's just finishing her 30th year of teaching. So that, that tells you how old I am. She will be here talking about letters from Paris, teenage pen pals as World War II approaches. Her grandmother at age 16 had a pen pal in Paris, and they wrote back and forth, but they continued beyond school, and then the war was approaching. Nazi Germany was threatening. Her pen pal was writing, why doesn't the United States come in and do something? And there was a brief, well, more than a brief, there was a period where there were no letters, and she had no idea whatever happened to her pen pal. Fascinating. I think you'll enjoy that one. September 21st. On October 19th, What Are You Wearing? The History of Fabric. Jeannie Doan, who is our assistant director and also our textile curator and our exhibit creator, and it goes on and on what Jeannie does. But she'll be talking about the fabrics and how discovering new fabrics or getting ways to grow new fabrics changed what people wore 100, 200 years ago. In November 16th, Thanksgiving, a fabricated holiday. Fred Compton, our good friend who comes every year, will be talking about Thanksgiving and how it sort of was made out of whole cloth there and sort of came out of nowhere. And then on December 14th, Christmas collectibles from the past, a dime store Christmas. Linda Martin is at the table in the back there. There she is. She'll be here. Some of you may remember Linda when she did showed her fantastic collection of Halloween artifacts. Well, she has a collection of Christmas decorations from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and it should be fascinating. And while she's up displaying that, her husband will have an opportunity to clean that part of the basement. It should be quite enjoyable. So we have a good rest of the year planned out for you as far as Lunch and Learns go, and hopefully you will take advantage of it and come visit us. Our speaker today is very special. I want to thank especially Joyce Lovins Browning for her assistance in arranging our speaker, Martha Washington. Without Joyce's help, literally we would have no speaker today. I don't see Joyce right now, but I'm sure when I see her, and I will thank her, and you will have an opportunity to thank her also. She was worked for the great parks of Hamilton County for over 20 years, a naturalist coordinator, retiring in 2018. She's been doing living history for about 20 years now, portraying a half a dozen characters, Joyce did. She's also a tour coordinator for Amazing Travel Treasures. With her help, we have before us today Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, the wife of George Washington, first president of the United States. Although the title was not coined at the time of her death, Martha Washington served as the inaugural, or if you will, the First Lady of the United States. During her lifetime, she was often referred to as Lady Washington. Slightly older than George, she married him shortly after being widowed at the age of 26. Martha's birthday is June 2nd, so tomorrow will be her birthday plus 2 weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you Lady Washington.
Thank you, John. Wow, it's nice to see everybody here. I really enjoy being in the company of other folks. I've always loved to have a lot of people around. And when I'm out and about, one of the most asked questions that I have is, what was it like to be married to one of the most famous, illustrious men of our time? And I have to stop and think about that sometimes, because I know my husband is going to be remembered for the deeds he has done, and I pretty much will just fade into history. But being married to George has been wonderful. We have been very good partners. But of course, I wasn't always Mrs. Washington. So I guess I should step back a little bit and start at the beginning, which is always the best place to start. I was born Martha Dandridge. I was the oldest daughter of 8 children. My parents was John and Frances Dandridge. My family had been in America since Jamestown, so we have several generations here. And I had 4 younger brothers, 3 younger sisters, so there was always children around, and I was always helping my mother. And Mother allowed us to sit in with the tutors of my brothers, So I was fortunate to learn how to read and write. But that's not where my education stopped. Of course, Mother insisted that I learn how to play the spinet and how to entertain and how to run a household, as well as sewing and a little bit of cooking. You never know when you have to do that. So as a young lady, I grew up pretty well like any other normal young lady. I wanted the same things as most girls my age, was to get married, marry well, and have a large family. And that's basically how my life started out. I did marry well, in fact, very well. I met this gentleman in our church. This gentleman was one of the deacons in our church, along with my father. In fact, he was only 1 year younger than my mother. His name was Daniel Park Custis, and he was the son of John Custis, one of the wealthiest landowners in Virginia. Now, Daniel, at 38 years old, had never been married before, and that was really no fault of his own. For he had wanted to get married more than one time, in fact, several times. But there was a reason he didn't. His sister never married either. In fact, every time she became engaged, her father decided that he would not give over her dowry. He didn't think that either one of his children should be in the horrible institution of marriage. That is how he termed it. So, to say the least, John Custis was a little bit on the cantankerous side. He didn't like anyone, and I doubt he even liked himself. He and his wife were notorious for fighting in public. They fought so much in public that one time they were in a carriage arguing, and before they knew it, they were in Chesapeake Bay. And when his wife asked him, "Where in the world do you think you're going?" he said, "I'm driving into hell, madam." And her reply was, "Lead on, because I'm right there with you." It was after that most famous argument that was witnessed by a lot of people that they decided to sign an agreement that they would no longer argue in public. And shortly after that, Mrs. Custis passed away. Now, Mrs. Custis brought a lot of fortune into the marriage. Her family was well off. She came from the Park family, which is where my husband got his middle name. So when Daniel decided he wanted to marry me, he said that he took a shine to me because I had a sparkle, and he had always admired me. He actually saw me grow up. There was 20 years between Daniel and I. I was 18 years old at the time. And I very much wanted to marry him too, but his father had done the same thing that he'd always done to Daniel and threatened to disinherit him if he got married. And of course, he was defaming my family all over town to anyone who would listen. And I'm not really someone who likes to take something like that lightly. I am proud of my family, and I didn't want them to be insulted. So I decided to pay Mr. Custis a visit. I paid him a visit, and we had a nice long talk that afternoon. And then he did something that he rarely ever did in his whole life, and that was change his mind. He changed his mind and gave Daniel and I permission to get married. And then he died. So out of respect for his father, we waited a short time before we married. Daniel, of course, was the sole heir of the Custis estates. They had more than 5 plantations, 17,500 acres, and more than 300 enslaved people. He was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. And his sister had already passed away, and of course I think she died more of loneliness and a broken heart than anything. So Daniel and I started off our marriage very well. We moved into his plantation of White House, and I set up housekeeping. At 18 years old, I found myself entirely in charge of a large household, which was a little frightening. But I managed. My mother taught me well. And it wasn't long after that that I was expecting our first child. And when our first son was born, we named him Daniel Park Custis after his father. My Danny was a beautiful little boy with dark ringlets, such a sweet kid. And not long after him followed our first daughter, Frances, named for my mother and Daniel's mother. So Frances was our second child. And Daniel, my husband, he was very good with his money, his plantation. We grew tobacco, and every year we sent ships of the tobacco to England along with lists of what we needed. We had a pretty nice home at this point, and everything was what you would say perfect. At least it was in my mind. So I was expecting our third child. It was a son. We named him John after Daniel's father, and we called him Jackie for short. So Jackie wasn't very old when things kind of changed. My father passed away suddenly in Williamsburg, unexpectedly leaving my mother with a newborn daughter, my youngest sister. And after my father's death, I lost one of my brothers. So things were changing faster than I liked when one of the most unthinkable things that a mother could go through happened. My Danny got sick. He got sick with a really bad fever, and before he was 4 years old, passed away. Now I know, as a mother, you have to expect these type of things. It's very rare that children live to be 5 years old sometimes. And if they do, they will become an adult most of the time. And so it wasn't long after that that I had my fourth child. We named her Martha after me. And we called her Patsy. And that was my nickname at the time, so I felt that it was more appropriate that I became Martha after my daughter was born. She wasn't very old when Frances passed away. Same thing as my Danny with a fever. And at that point, I think is when I became more nervous about my children. I didn't want to become an overbearing mother, but I was becoming overprotective, and I knew that. So anything that my other children wanted, Jackie, I very rarely disciplined him. And when he got sick, my heart just totally froze. I was so afraid of losing Jackie that when Daniel followed suit, my husband, he got sick with sore throat and fever as well. I did the best I could with nursing them. We called doctors, and unfortunately, my Daniel passed away. Jackie, however, recovered. So I found myself as a 26-year-old widow after barely 8 years of marriage, as a young mother and one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. My Daniel died without a will. When he died without a will, his estates was divided into thirds. It was both my children and myself. And I didn't have time to grieve for my husband at this point. It was one of these things where you have to pick yourself up the best you can and move on. And I didn't want to hire a steward or anyone else to take care of our affairs. Daniel had been a very good businessman. He had kept excellent records, and I felt that I could do the same. So I did. I took over the books that he had been keeping, and with the help of my overseers at the other farms that we owned, we turned a good profit. But after a couple years, I found myself not only being lonely, but I just wanted more children. I wanted to get married again. And of course, I had younger sisters, and they all knew eligible gentlemen. I didn't know at the time that I was a very hot commodity, so to speak. And it seemed like every gentleman I met had marriage upon his mind. And there was one particular gentleman, Mr. Carter. He was also a very wealthy landowner, and he paid court to me quite often. I enjoyed his company. He was a very nice gentleman, but he was older than my parents. He had children older than I and grandchildren. And that's not really what I wanted. You know, I married Daniel in the beginning, but I was in the position to choose whom I married. Now, Daniel and I, we attended a lot of social gatherings in our day. We went to all the barbecues and all of the parties during the season in Williamsburg. And so, therefore, I had met a lot of people. One particular gentleman, I remember, a young lieutenant that attended a party. When he walked into a room, he always walked into a room, if you know what I mean. At 6'2", he was hard to dismiss. And he was not only athletic, but very light on his feet. Very good dancer. All the ladies wanted to dance with George Washington. And excuse me, but George was in the military. George had been, excuse me, I'm so sorry. I think the trees are blooming and not liking me very well. With George being a military man, he was slightly younger than I was, not quite a whole year, and he was home on leave. When he was in Williamsburg, he learned of Daniel's passing. And at that particular time, it was like 25 miles to our plantation at White House. So I was receiving a lot of callers, and my sister and her husband was there, my younger sister. And that is when George arrived to pay his respects. He paid his respects and stayed for dinner, and we had a nice long conversation, and we talked, and I think we hit it off immediately. George was a very nice young man. He was the oldest son of his mother, but he had older step-siblings, and his father had been married before, and when his first wife died, he married George's mother, who was Mary Ball, Washington. Mary was a little bit overbearing, but she was widowed when George was only 10 years old. George never got the opportunity to have the education that his older half-brothers had. He very much enjoyed the company of his brother Lawrence. Lawrence had tuberculosis, and therefore, when the doctors told him he needed to go somewhere tropical for his health, George was the one who decided to go with him, and they went to Barbados. And Barbados in the wintertime was still very, very warm. Now, George was only 17 at the time, and he caught smallpox. There was an epidemic of smallpox going around. And I think because he was so young and strong and athletic, that is why he survived that dreaded disease. But it left a mark on him. And I don't mean a physical mark, it did mark him up a little, but that only added to his rugged handsomeness, I thought. But it left an impression on him, should I say. So with George not having the ability to, or the funds to have the good education, he ended up going and becoming a surveyor. And when he did some surveying, he also then entered the military. And he was in the Ohio country quite often, especially during the French and Indian War. And with George, he highly prized education. So he was always constantly reading, constantly learning. He wanted to be the best he could be. So I immediately asked him to visit me again next time he was around, and to visit before he went back to his post, which he did. And it was after our second meeting that I think we both decided that we were going to get married. He had inherited Mount Vernon from his brother Lawrence. His brother Lawrence did pass away, and his widow did not want Mount Vernon, and so George was the one who inherited that. George immediately went to work on improving it and remodeling it and everything. He had decided that marriage was the way he wanted to go. He also wanted a large family. So marrying a widow that already had 2 children was a good start. So George and I, we set the date. George loved Christmas. That was his favorite holiday. And we got married on 12th night, which is January the 6th. And we set up home. We immediately moved from my home in White House to his plantation at Mount Vernon. Now, Mount Vernon at that time was over 2,000 acres. George had added on another story and a half, making it quite a large home. He also wanted to put some verandas here. It overlooked the Potomac River, which was a very beautiful view. My children loved running around in its rooms. Jackie, of course, loved all the trees that were around. Jackie loved to climb trees. And so for years, we had a very, what George always termed, a very agreeable marriage. I was an agreeable partner, was how he would word it sometimes. So as our years together progressed, our children grew. Unfortunately, we did not have any children of our own. We were not blessed with that. But as my siblings, some of them had already passed away, they left young nieces and nephews that we took in, and we always had young children in our home. So we were together for quite a number of years before the unrest in the country began. And George was a member of the House of Burgesses, and he also, with having the military experience that he did as a young man, when the war did break out, George was a natural choice to lead the colonial army. And of course, George was very duty bound. Whether it was family or anything else, George felt a strong sense of duty. And that was something that his mother knew and something his mother pushed on a lot. As a widow, she felt George should be a very dutiful son and help her out with a lot of things. So I think they had a little bit of a strained relationship. Mary and I did not get along as well either. But that's a whole nother story. So George, like I said, became head of the Continental Army. That was something that I did not like the idea of, but it was not my choice. And so every winter, when they would go into winter quarters, they didn't fight as much during the cold times. That is when I myself would load up numerous wagons full of supplies, and I would meet George wherever he was for winter quarters. I think I spent more than half of the war with him in his winter quarters. And other officers' wives would come too, Lucy Knox and Kitty Green. So they were my companions, and we would sit many nights and make gloves and hats and scarves and socks for the soldiers. And we always brought food. I do remember when the soldiers were chanting at Valley Forge, you know, no bread, no soldiers. We showed up, I think, just in time. And that is where I think my title of Lady Washington came into. The boys decided that Mrs. Washington was not good enough, that I was the general's wife, and that they had never seen somebody work so hard for the time frame from morning to night. I would write letters for them, for those who couldn't write, and I helped those that were sick. It was good for me. I had always wanted a lot of children, and I had an entire army of sons. And so I felt obligated to take care of them. But as the war years came to a close, and we were getting to where we were coming to an end, my son Jackie, who had wanted to get married instead of go to school, which George had opposed. This was a little bit before the war. Jackie did not like education. He'd rather play around than do anything like that. He did the bare minimum. He decided he wanted to get married, which was fine by me, but George was a little bit opposed to it. He thought Jackie was far too young. Jackie was 18 at the time, which is how old I was when I married. His wife was the same age as my youngest daughter, Patsy. They were 17 years old. Patsy was not really in good health. She, from the time she was 12 years old, was having seizures that we could not control. We took her to numerous doctors. We took her to Healing Springs. We tried all kinds of medications that we could, and there was nothing that was helping her. And as she got older, the seizures got worse. So it was a very, very hot August day, and you know how when it's hot, you have to keep both doors open in the breezeway so that you can have some cool breezes during the day. And she and my new daughter-in-law and I would sit there and sew and do different things. And it was shortly after dinner that night when she went in to get Jackie's latest letter to show his wife, and she had a very bad seizure. And before George could catch her and put her upon the bed, she was gone. So I had already lost 3 out of my 4 children. So when Jackie decided he wanted to go into the service with George, George put him on his staff. And he was only in for a very short time when he caught typhus. His wife had already had 4 children at this point, so I did have 4 grandchildren. And then Jackie passed away from that. I was able to get to his bedside along with George and his wife before he died, but he was only 26. So I had lost all of my children and most of my siblings at that point in my life. So when the war came to an end, I was so looking forward to George and I going home and being able to get back into our life at Mount Vernon. We had some grandchildren that we were going to be helping raise. I also had a niece that was staying with me at the time. She was one of my favorite nieces. My sister had passed away. And it just so happens that she became interested in one of George's favorite nephews. So I think there was a wedding there in the future. So At this point, we were happy just to be home. Mount Vernon had been run by some of the family. George had put a lot of his nephews in charge of it. But he also had a secretary that was very good, Tobias Lear, who was one of his servants that truly helped him out a lot. And that is when our brand new country needed a leader. And of course, they voted unanimously to make George the king. Of course, he declined. He said, we just got out from under one king. I don't think we need another one. So president was the title he decided would be best, and that it should have just 4 years as a term, and that he would serve as the first president. This was not really something I wanted him to do, but like I said, George took his duty to not only the family, but to the country extremely seriously. So the new capital, or the temporary capital, was going to be New York City. We were to go to New York. George went ahead to make preparations, and he left me behind with 2 of our grandchildren that we were raising. They were Jackie's 2 youngest kids because his widow had remarried at this point. And I had to pack for a 4-year vacation. How do you do that? How do you pack up your household and move it 250 miles away for 4 whole years? It was very difficult. George wanted me to there right now. I need you up here now. He wrote me a lot of letters with that, but I took my time making sure that I had everything I thought I needed. So it was 2 months later. He had sent his nephew down to escort us, very serious young man. At 19 years old, he was much like his uncle, and it took us almost 12 days to get there. Now, I'm not a big fan of water, so crossing some of these spring rivers at running very high was not something I liked. And we had a nice coach that the children and I rode in, but by the end of the day, I don't care who you are, you're normally covered with dust. So when I would get into a town, everyone that had been there to accept my husband when he came through, they gave him dinners and speeches, and everyone wanted to meet him. They also wanted to meet me. So as the answer to the question that most people ask me, what is it like to be married to George Washington? It is a most wonderful thing, because even though I felt like I didn't do anything, but he told me I was his anchor, I was his moral support, they all treated me as if I was royalty. Lady Washington was accepted everywhere, dinners and dances. So the children, of course, had a grand time. I think my grandchildren made friends with other children for the first time that wasn't a relative. And as we journeyed there, our life settled in, and it wasn't a very large home that they provided for us, but George had visitors, it seemed like at all hours of the time. That is when he decided he had to set parameters and tell them he would only see people at a certain time. And as soon as I arrived, I was informed I had to present a dinner, which of course I enjoyed doing. That was something I was trained to do. So being the president's wife was enjoyable. We had good times, and I was so looking forward to, after the 4 years, going home to Mount Vernon when George accepted a second term. And I was trying to be very patient, and we had to move again. They changed the capital to Philadelphia at that particular time. So Philadelphia is where we spent the next 4 years. And after that 4 years, and the kids were getting older, and our Mount Vernon had been run by so many family members, I told him, I said, George, please, let's go home. And he agreed. You know, when neither one was young anymore, we were both getting up there, and we were very much wanting to go home. So in 1797, we were able to finally go back to Mount Vernon. One of George's favorite things was agriculture. He loved growing things, loved growing different things. He was fascinated by agriculture. I think that's something he picked up when he was in Barbados, because everything grew down there. And so he would ride around the property. He had 2 of the horses that had carried him through the war that he retired at Mount Vernon. They were his 2 favorite steeds. And every other day he would take another one out so they wouldn't get jealous. And he would ride around Mount Vernon. And around 3 o'clock he would come back home, and that's when we were going to have dinner. He would always change his clothes, and there would always be guests. I don't care what time of the day it was, we always had visitors. We had visitors from all over, even across in Europe. They all wanted to meet the great man. There was one gentleman that showed up one time from England, and when he showed up on the doorstep, he was very sick. He had a very bad cold. And so I put him in one of the downstairs bedrooms. We had built on to that point where we had 9 bedrooms, each one a different color, decorated a different way. And this young man was so sorry that he showed up sick, but in the middle of the night, George went to check on him. And something he wrote down in his diary was that he never expected to wake up and see the great man standing over him with a cup of hot tea. But George was always concerned about our visitors. He never wanted to delay dinner. And I think that was part of what really brought him down. Because in December, it was a cold, rainy December, and he had been out riding. And because of the rain or something else happened, I don't remember which right now, but he showed back up and we had a lot of guests. Dinner was ready, so he opted not to change his wet clothes and coat and get out of it. So he went all evening in damp clothes. And a couple of days later, he was complaining of a sore throat. Now see, George always had trouble with his throat and his teeth. He always had bad teeth, and in fact, at that point in his life, he had not one tooth in his head. That was his. He did have several sets. I think that's why most of the speeches he ever made in his life were pretty short and sweet, because he just didn't like to talk in public. And after he got sick, with all my other family that got sick, I was totally worried. I stayed at his bedside night and day. George was a big believer in doctors and their methods. He never questioned them. So he did allow them to bleed him, and I was so concerned that they were bleeding him way too much. But when George passed away, just before, he wanted me to bring him both of his wills. He had 2, and he wanted to look them over to see which one he wanted to keep. We burned the one he did not want to keep. And in that will that he chose, he decided that he was going to set free all of the slaves that he owned outright, but not until my death. He never wanted to inconvenience me. So that is where we are. I have moved out of our bedroom, and I don't think I can ever go back. I think I'll just move to the 3rd floor where I can sit and read my Bible and sew and enjoy my grandchildren. And I have some great-grandchildren now. And we still love to have visitors at Mount Vernon. I have nieces and nephews that help me out quite a bit. So if you're ever in the neighborhood, please stop by. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joyce and Martha. Please join us next month when Martin Gottlieb will be talking about Clement Vallandigham, the famous Copperhead during the Civil War who thought Lincoln helped cause the Civil War, and what a thorn he was on Lincoln's side.